All right, so here is the manuscript I was telling you about. Ooh, sweet Caroline, what's the word count on this thing? It's over 200,000 words. You're serious? Elantris was the first book that Brandon Sanderson ever published, and it's often cited by many people as their least favorite of his books. They'll say things like the characters are not that interesting compared to his other books, or the plotline is unusually slow and plodding. I'm not here to talk today about where I think Elantris fits on a Cosmere tier list, though. I'm here to talk about why I think Elantris worked in the first place. The thing I find interesting about Elantris is that it breaks almost every rule that you'll hear for a debut novel. For one thing, it is obscenely long by the standards of debut novels. It clocks in at about 205,000 words. And if you happen to be an aspiring author who spends a lot of time looking at websites that give advice for breaking into traditional publishing, that's me. I do that. I'm that aspiring author. Then you may have seen that the recommended word count for most debut novels is something around 80,000 words. For fantasy, they say it can go a little bit longer, by which they mean something like 120,000 words. If you get up to 150,000, that's a big no-go. And if you're talking 200,000, absolutely you don't have a chance. That's the traditional wisdom. By that traditional wisdom, Elantris should never have had a prayer of getting published. But it breaks lots of other rules as well. For one thing, it has a very weird setting and an unconventional magic system, which in the late 90s and early 2000s, when Brandon Sanderson was querying, was a bit strange and maybe a throw-off to a lot of literary agents. Also, it is a standalone novel, despite being set in a massive, sprawling world with a complex geopolitical environment. A lot of agents, when they're looking at debut novels, want to see that a novel has series potential, and Brandon Sanderson was not interested in that. And even the fact that the novel starts with the main character waking up is a huge turnoff for a lot of agents. I see literary agents all the time who say that when a novel starts with the main character waking up, it's an immediate turnoff for them because it's just a cliche way to start a book. However, despite all of this, Elantris was the start of the entire Cosmere, which has now gone on to become one of the best-selling fantasy series of all time, and was the catalyst for the insane Kickstarter earlier this year that raised $41 million or something crazy like that. Now, obviously, a lot of Brandon Sanderson's success didn't come from Elantris alone. Mistborn ended up being much more popular, and obviously his work on the Wheel of Time is a large part of what made him into what he is today. However, I think Elantris really set the stage for everything that was to come, and after thinking about it for a while, I think that the reason Elantris succeeded so much is because, rather than in spite of, the way it breaks from everything that literary agents and fantasy fans at the time of the novel's publication wanted. One of the ways he did this was by breaking away from the grimdark George R.R. Martin aesthetic that had dominated the fantasy genre for a decade or a couple decades at that point. When he was trying to get published, he said that he constantly was having agents tell him that he should write more like George R.R. Martin, and he said he tried doing that and it didn't work out so well. And so Elantris feels really different from a lot of the novels that had been published before it. For one thing, the protagonist, Raoden, is this guy who's almost perpetually in a good mood, even though the situation that's being described in the novel that Raoden is thrust into is just about the most horrific situation I've seen in a fantasy book. The tone of the novel doesn't reflect that darkness, and anyone who's read Sanderson can agree that that's very much a trademark of his, that he's able to explore really dark topics in a heartwarming and engaging way. But the novel still does have these political intrigue elements that were so popular in fantasy fiction in the early 2000s. Much of the novel revolves around the machinations of Hrathen and Serene. I have no idea how to pronounce her name. And in this way, Sanderson also breaks from classical fantasy. When I say classical fantasy, I mean fantasy about some farm boy who gets a magic sword and goes on a quest joined by an old wizard to go defeat an evil dragon or something like that. That type of fantasy tended to be a little bit more chipper than the grimdark kind of fantasy that was really popular in the early 2000s. What Sanderson kind of did is combine elements from both of those aesthetics. He takes the lightheartedness of classical fantasy and sort of the warmth and the the good vibes of Tolkien, and combines that with more modern, gritty themes. So all of those things are what engage the reader, I think, throughout the novel, and what sets it apart initially from other books that were coming out at the time. But I think for me, and I'm biased because Elantris was my first Cosmere book, not my first Sanderson book, but my first Cosmere book. For me, the thing that really cemented it as being unique was the legendary sanderlanche. A sanderlanche, for those who aren't aware, is the scientific term for when all of the plot threads at the end of a Brandon Sanderson novel come together in a really epic and satisfying way. And there's something about a sanderlanche that just feels very distinct. In the case of Elantris, I think what made the sanderlanche so different and effective is the fact that the entire novel is structured in a very rigid way. You know, you have three main characters, three main perspectives, and you get one chapter from the first character's perspective, one chapter from the second character's perspective, and one chapter from the third character's perspective before going back and starting the whole thing all over again. In the sanderlanche, at the very end of this novel, that structure completely breaks down, and you start getting POVs from characters that you've never gotten POVs from before. The whole thing just becomes rather messy. And on top of that, the sanderlanche in this book just feels so massive. The things that happen at the end of this book fundamentally change the entire world. And even though it doesn't have the same elegance as we would get in the climaxes of later books, like Words of Radiance, for instance, all of the seeds for what would make later sanderlanches so great are here in this book. I think if there's one big takeaway from all of this, the thing that Sanderson was not afraid to do in Elantris was to go big. Big both in terms of word count, but also big in terms of the world and in terms of the events that happen in this novel. He broke all of the rules with this book and wrote the novel that he was interested in writing rather than the novel that other people want to write. And as an aspiring author myself, I find that really inspiring and informative. He saw that there were types of stories that were not really being told and wrote those stories and continued to write those stories because that's just what he ended up being naturally good at. And I think that's why, even as early as Elantris, he already started growing a dedicated fan base who were interested in speculating about the broader world that his books took place in. Sanderson, with Elantris, carved out a niche for himself. And it's not perfect, and it may be the weakest Cosmere book, but that didn't stop Sanderson from writing it. I think the main takeaway here is to just, if you are a writer or an aspiring writer, to write what you're good at and constantly improve upon it. Because Elantris was the start. All of the seeds of his later books were in that book, I think. So yeah, that's all I've got for you today. But thanks for tuning in, and until next time, stay generic. Should that be like a catchphrase? Stay generic? I don't know. Does that sound just absolutely horrible?